I thought I would tell you a little bit about amphibians. And as you can see, I've got a couple of frogs with me to keep me company. Now, amphibians are an incredible class of vertebrate animals, and you can actually split living amphibians into 3 different groups. Firstly, you have Anurans, which are your frogs and toads. The order Urodela includes your salamanders and your newts, of which I will show you a few of those later on. And then the final extant order, so by extant I mean the animals that are still alive living today, as opposed to extinct, which is those which have, well, gone extinct. Yet that final order is the order Gymnophiona, which includes a group of amphibians called Caecilians. So starting off with these awesome little guys, these are white tree frogs, and they're a species of tropical and subtropical tree frog that comes from the northeastern side of Australia and also Papua New Guinea. They're one of the largest tree frogs out there, and they're pretty hardy little guys as amphibians go. Now, these guys, like most amphibians, are nocturnal, so typically they would be coming out and about during night time. Now, unlike geckos that use lamellae and microscopic hairs to adhere to smooth surfaces, tree frogs have sticky suction pads at the end of their feet, and these suction pads are made up of a load of hexagons on the underside of their feet that have channels that allow mucus through into them, which gives them this extra sticky suction cup-like grip, which allows them to grip onto lots of surfaces. Now, these frogs, particularly the males, can actually be quite noisy, and of course frogs are known for making a croaking noise. How they make that is they have a flap of skin under the neck known as a dewlap, and in frogs that has become specialised into a vocal sac, or in some species of frogs it divides in two to become 2 vocal sacs. Now, how this sac works is essentially as a resonating chamber, so that when the male frogs call, it echoes within that sac, and these vocal sacs essentially magnify the sound so that it carries over a very, very large area for such a small animal. Now, though we can hear the croaks, each of the frogs has their own call, and this is an example of intrasexual communication, where these frogs have a unique call, a unique croak, which can be heard and recognised by all others of their own species. So next up we have an example from the order of Urodela, the newts and salamanders. This here is a fire salamander. They're beautiful little guys, and they're native to mainland Europe, of which actually several species of fire salamander are known. As you can see, he's got this beautifully vibrant coloration of deep black against bright, vibrant yellow. Now, that coloration is actually a warning to potential predators. It's what's known as aposematic coloration. And the reason it is so bright and vibrant is to tell predators that he is actually highly toxic, and if they eat him, they could well get severe poisoning. Fire salamanders are capable of exuding very potent toxins, quite a cocktail of toxins, including a toxin called Samandarin, from structures just behind the eye called Parotid Glands, which are specialist glands that can excrete this cocktail of nasty chemicals. If ingested, this toxin can cause hyperventilation and severe muscle spasms in a predator. So this coloration is a pretty good warning sign to stay away. They are truly stunning amphibians, and I actually think it's a bit unfortunate that we don't have them native to the UK, because they're pretty much everywhere else in Western Europe. Unlike many other species of amphibians, fire salamanders are also capable of giving birth to live young, so they are essentially Ovoviviparous. They retain eggs within themselves and then give birth to either fully formed terrestrial young that don't need to go through an aquatic stage, or they give birth to live aquatic larvae. All in all, they're pretty fascinating little creatures, and yet, even though they look pretty exotic with that coloration, we're lucky enough that they are native to continental Europe. So, up next we have one of my favourite amphibian species called the cane toad. They're native to tropical regions of Central and South America, but they're also a highly invasive species which has managed to colonise many other countries around the world, often at the detriment to the native wildlife. Now, at one point I was living in Australia and I used to see these guys out there all the time. Australia is one of the worst affected countries by invasive cane toads. They were released into Australia about 80 years ago now, and their range has extended every year. So even though originally they were released to a relatively small region up in Queensland, they now occupy many more parts of Australia. Now, you might be thinking, why would anyone release a non-native species into another country? Well, with the cane toad, the original reason it was released into Australia was because people thought it would be a really good pest control agent for a beetle called the cane beetle, which normally eats sugarcane. However, after releasing thousands of cane toads into Australia, they realised that the cane toads, rather than eating the cane beetle, which normally lives at the top of the cane plant, would turn their attention instead to the native fauna, and they have decimated it for about 80 years now. This one here isn't actually an adult yet, and he's already pretty sizable. He's probably only about half grown, maybe not even quite half grown, so you can get an idea of just how big eventually they can become. And as well as being just a very large toad that's able to fit lots of food into its mouth, one of the other reasons they're so detrimental to the native wildlife of countries into which they've been introduced is because they are highly toxic. Now, the toxins that these guys emit, which are collectively known as bufotoxins, are cardiac glycosides, which basically means they can dramatically affect the heart of the animal they poison, and in really severe cases this can cause cardiac arrest and can kill the animal. One of the other toxins that cane toads emit is something called Bufotenin, which is hallucinogenic. So as well as being able to just kill an animal outright by causing cardiac arrest, they can also cause hallucinations in some of the animals that they poison. So they're a really dangerous toad, but I have to admit, one of the reasons they are my favourite is I actually admire how successful they are in the habitats that they invade. Now, I may as well point out as well, while I've got this guy, that everyone is aware that there are frogs and toads and people kind of group them separately, but there's not really any specific classification that makes a certain anuran a toad or that makes it a frog. It's literally just that normally toads are anurans that we associate with having a drier, more warty skin, whereas frogs are normally the species that are more aquatic and have a smoother, damper skin. But otherwise, there's no set family or set order that separates frogs from toads. So there you go, that is the highly invasive cane toad. Alright, so while we're on the subject of large frogs, this is an absolute Goliath. This is the largest species of amphibian that I work with, and it is an African bullfrog, and it even dwarfs the cane toad. This guy weighs about half a kilo, but when fully grown, and he is still growing, he could max out at over a kilo in weight, which is a truly large frog. Now, African bullfrogs have a relatively large range in sub-Saharan Africa, and unlike the cane toad that has quite dry, warty skin, even though this guy's skin is relatively rough, it is still quite damp. Now, this guy comes from lots of regions in sub-Saharan Africa, and as you might expect, he is one of the largest species of frogs out there, but he's not the largest species of frog. That title belongs to a species known as the Goliath frog, and it gets even bigger than this guy. Now, many frogs, including this guy, are what you would term R-selected species. Now, all species of animals can be split into two types, either R-selected or K-selected species, depending on their reproductive strategy. Now, most amphibians, like this guy, are what we would term R-selected species, which is where they have many young, but they don't show much maternal care of those young. The other kind of species you can get are K-selected species, and those are animals that normally have few young but invest a lot of time in maternal care. So, for example, an elephant has one baby at a time, has a very long gestation period, but puts a lot of time after birth into making sure that that animal has a really good chance of surviving. However, amphibians like this bullfrog choose the other option, which is R-selecting, which basically means they have hundreds or even thousands of young in the form of tadpoles, and those young individually have a relatively low chance of making it to adulthood, but by having lots of them, this guy ensures he has a good chance that his genes will carry on to the next generation and the one after that. Now, African bullfrogs, just like all amphibians, are what we would term lower vertebrates, also known as anamniotes. and that is because they're completely reliant on water for reproduction. So all vertebrates can be split into either higher or lower vertebrates. Lower vertebrates include fish and amphibians, because both of these animals require water in order to reproduce, and your higher vertebrates include reptiles, birds and mammals, which either produce eggs which are protected in a shell and they can be laid on land away from water, or in the case of mammals, they don't lay eggs at all and they look after their young, again, away from water in a womb. So, moving from the continent of Africa to the continent of North America with these guys, and we're keeping with the large theme. These are tiger salamanders, and they are the largest terrestrial salamanders in the world. So, tiger salamanders, just like all amphibians, are anamniotes, as we've just discussed, and that means that they rely on water in order to reproduce. So these tiger salamanders will reproduce in water, and their larvae will reside in water sometimes for many, many years before metamorphosizing or changing into these terrestrial adults. But the young of tiger salamanders are quite interesting in as much as they don't actually have to have a terrestrial form of life, and they can stay as a giant larvae and reproduce in that form without ever having to come out of the water onto land. And the individuals that do reside permanently as larvae are known as being neotenic, with neoteny being the process whereby juvenile characteristics are retained into adulthood. Tiger salamanders are a type of salamander called mole salamanders, which means they're very good at digging, and they spend a lot of their time living underground, only coming out in the dead of night to look for small invertebrates to eat. And that is because, just like all amphibians, they need to stay moist and keep their skin damp in order to stay alive. And if they come out during the day, they risk drying out in the sun. One of the other interesting biological quirks of salamanders and newts is that they're very, very good at regenerating and healing themselves. They can actually regenerate whole limbs. But yeah, there you have it, the tiger salamander, a fascinating and very large salamander. So, up next we have a Pac-Man frog, which comes from the continent of South America, just under the Amazon rainforest region, and they live in forest as well as grassland areas like the Gran Chaco, which is basically a large area of savanna grassland in South America. Now, they get their common name of Pac-Man because, just like Pac-Man, they will eat pretty much anything they can fit into their mouths, and they've got a pretty big mouth at that. Now, these frogs, just like all frogs, when it's time to mate, will fertilise eggs via external fertilisation, which is a bit unusual. Most tetrapod life forms, and by tetrapod I basically mean any land-living vertebrates, most tetrapod life forms will use internal fertilisation, where the egg of an animal is fertilised internally. However, frogs use external fertilisation, and when they're ready to mate, frogs, just like this Pac-Man frog, will adopt this position known as amplexus, which is where a male frog will piggyback on the back of a female frog, and as soon as the female lays her eggs into water, the male will immediately fertilise them externally as they exit the female's body, which is pretty cool. Now, another thing that's pretty nifty about frogs like this guy is how they drink. Now, frogs don't drink in the same way as most vertebrates. So they don't lap up water, but what they do instead is they can sit in a body of water, and there's a region of highly vascularized skin, so skin that has a good blood supply, and that is on the stomach, and that is known as a pelvic patch or a seat patch, and it's a unique way that frogs are able to drink water. Now, this pelvic patch or seat patch only accounts for about 10% of the total surface area of the skin, but it's responsible for as much as 70% of the water uptake. So by sitting in a small puddle of water, the pelvic patch or seat patch allows for rapid uptake of water to hydrate the frog. Next up, I have a couple of tomato frogs which come from the island of Madagascar. There are 3 different species of tomato frogs, and I'm lucky enough to work with one of them. I think you can see why they get their common name, because they basically just look like big squidgy tomatoes. This is a species that also shows sexual dimorphism, so both of the individuals I have here are female, and if I had a male it would be about 1/3 of the size, so quite a lot smaller than that. Tomato frogs, like all frogs, have semi-permeable skin. It's one of the defining characteristics of amphibians. So what that means is that they can soak up water through their skin via osmosis, so water can pass in and out of their body quite freely, and it can do that over the entire skin surface, not just the seat patch or the pelvic patch that I just told you about. Now, this semi-permeable membrane skin makes amphibians relatively delicate compared to most other animals, and that's because they can dry out very easily, because obviously water can exit the body via all of the skin, and not only that, but it also means that any dangerous chemicals can go into the skin with the water very easily via osmosis and diffusion. What this means when keeping amphibians is you have to be very careful with the water that you give them, because most tap water that humans drink has quite a lot of chlorine or fluoride in it, and these minerals can be dangerous for amphibians if they go into their skin and can disrupt osmotic control, so they can destabilise the water balance inside the frogs' bodies, which can be quite dangerous for them. So these guys get special dechlorinated water that has the chlorine and fluoride taken out of it, and that makes it safe for these guys to absorb through their skin. Now, as well as allowing relatively free movement of water, the skin also acts as a secondary respiratory surface and allows oxygen to pass into the animals via diffusion. In fact, some amphibians, such as lungless salamanders, don't have any lungs at all and rely entirely upon their skin for respiration. So again, because of all of these characteristics, amphibians are relatively delicate forms of life, and some people class them as something called ecological indicators, which means because they're so delicate and sensitive, if scientists are wanting to examine the health of an ecosystem, they can look first at the amphibians in that ecosystem, because if something's going wrong, it's normally the amphibians that will feel it first and be most adversely affected. In fact, on the subject of these guys being delicate, many amphibians, particularly frogs, are threatened in their native habitat by something called chytrid fungus or chytridiomycosis. So chytrid fungus causes a severe disease in frogs and most other amphibians called chytridiomycosis, which can be lethal for them. And it's mainly isolated to the tropical and subtropical parts of the world, but it can spread really quite rapidly, and it is decimating amphibian populations worldwide. And there you go, that is the fascinating group of animals that is amphibians.